Every World of Warcraft expansion lives or dies on three things: borrowed power, time gating, and whether the developers are designing the game for you or against you. Shadowlands committed every single one of these sins at the same time, and it did it so thoroughly that longtime players quit for 2 full years straight. This is the story of WoW's worst expansions, and we're starting with the one that nearly killed the game, Shadowlands. Shadowlands launched in November 2020 and immediately became the most criticized major release in franchise history. And I can prove it because the problems weren't subtle. They were baked into every single system the expansion shipped with. Let's start with the Covenant system. The idea was simple. Pick one of 4 Afterlife factions, get a unique ability, and enjoy your new cosmic home. Sounds great, right? Except your Covenant choice locked you into specific abilities that were wildly unbalanced across classes. Pick the wrong one and your damage output tanks. Pick the right one and congratulations. You're now stuck with a transmog set you hate because the meta demanded it. Want to switch? That'll cost you weeks of grinding. It was a trap disguised as a choice. Hey, pick whichever one feels right. Cool, but 3 of them make your character objectively worse. Then there was the Maw. The Maw was the expansion's mandatory endgame zone, and I genuinely believe it was designed by someone who hates fun as a concept. No mounts, no flying, just you trudging through the ugliest zone in WoW history while the Eye of the Jailer mechanic ticked up like a parking meter from hell. Stay too long and the zone literally punishes you for playing the game. It wasn't difficulty. It was a time gate wearing a Halloween costume, and your reward for enduring all of this? Oribos, the expansion's capital city, which had all the charm of an airport terminal. No character, no life, just a gray circle where you stood around waiting to be somewhere else. The entire Afterlife theme never cohered into something that actually felt like Warcraft. The result was the worst subscriber hemorrhage in the game's history. Players didn't just complain, they left. For 2 full years, the team that made Legion one of the most beloved expansions ever somehow produced this. I don't know what to tell you, but if Shadowlands was the rock bottom, the fall actually started one expansion earlier. Battle for Azeroth. Legion was a masterpiece. Everybody knew it. Blizzard knew it. The players knew it. So when Battle for Azeroth launched in August 2018, expectations were through the roof, and Blizzard responded to those expectations by designing a gear system that literally punished you for getting loot. Let me explain. The centerpiece of BFA was Azerite armor, a system where you'd select traits on your gear pieces to customize your build. Sounds great on paper. In practice, many of those traits were either statistically meaningless or flat out incompatible with your spec. So you'd kill a raid boss, get a shiny new chest piece with a higher item level, equip it, and watch your character get weaker. That's not a bug. The system working as intended. You could receive a direct upgrade and have it be a downgrade, which is, not ideal, but here's where it gets worse. The sources for actually good Azerite pieces were severely limited. You couldn't just grind for them. You had specific weekly lockouts, specific raid bosses, and if nothing dropped, tough luck. Come back next week. Players went weeks at a time with 0 meaningful progression, not because they weren't playing, but because the system physically would not let them progress faster. Hey, I've been running this raid for a month and I still don't have a usable chest piece. Cool. That's also a thing that happened. And then there were island expeditions, Blizzard's big new 3-player mode, procedurally generated islands where you'd race to collect resources against an enemy team. The idea was that every island would feel different. The reality was that every island felt exactly the same, just with slightly different trees. The rewards were bad, the gameplay was repetitive, nobody asked for this mode, and after about 2 weeks, nobody played it either. It was the video game equivalent of being handed a participation trophy you didn't want. Here's the thing about BFA though. It didn't make people quit the way Shadowlands did. It did something arguably worse. It made people stop caring. Players logged in, sighed, did their weekly chores, and logged out feeling nothing. No rage, no excitement. Just this low-grade disappointment that sat in your chest like cold oatmeal. Legion proved Blizzard could make magic. BFA proved that lightning doesn't strike twice, but if BFA was a slow, grinding disappointment, the expansion we're covering next was a full-speed nosedive off a cliff. Warlords of Draenor. For years, WoW players begged for one thing above everything else: player housing. A place to call their own. A base they could build, customize, and show off. And in November 2014, Blizzard finally delivered with Warlords of Draenor's garrison system. Players got their personal fortress, they got buildings building plots, followers, mission tables, profession huts, resource nodes, all of it tucked inside a private, upgradable compound. And it killed the game. Here's the thing, garrisons were so efficient, so self-contained that players had zero reason to leave them. Need herbs? Garrison. Need ore? Garrison. Need to send followers on missions for golden gear? Garrison. You could log in, click a few tables, collect your rewards, and log out without ever seeing another human being. In a massively multiplayer online game, which is, you know, not ideal. The capital cities went empty. The open world felt abandoned. Blizzard had accidentally built the most effective anti-social system in MMO history. Players weren't adventuring together anymore. They were sitting alone in their little forts, clicking buttons like they were playing a mobile game. Hey, what are you up to in WoW? Oh, you know, managing my spreadsheet fortress, living the dream. But the garrisons weren't the only controversy. Blizzard also decided to completely remove flying mounts from Draenor. Their reasoning was that ground travel made the world feel bigger and more immersive. The community's reasoning was that they'd had flying for 3 expansions, and this felt like getting their car keys confiscated by a parent who thought walking builds character. The backlash was sustained and loud enough that Blizzard eventually reversed the decision in a later patch, but not before months of frustration had already pushed players away. And here's where it gets really frustrating. The individual pieces of Warlords of Draenor were genuinely good. The zones were gorgeous. The questing experience from 90 to 100 was some of the best leveling content Blizzard had ever produced. The raids, particularly Blackrock Foundry and Hellfire Citadel, were praised as top-tier encounters. The bones were excellent, but that's all there was. Bones, promised features, never materialized. A continent-spanning transit system that was supposed to connect to the Grim Raven Depot simply didn't exist. The expansion gained 600,000 subscribers before launch on hype alone, then hemorrhaged players at a rate that made Blizzard stop publicly reporting subscriber numbers entirely. The development cycle was clearly rushed, and what shipped felt like Act 1 of a 3-act expansion where Acts 2 and 3 got left on the cutting room floor. Warlords of Draenor is the expansion that proves good ingredients don't guarantee a good meal. But at least it only wasted 1 expansion's worth of potential. Cataclysm managed to waste an entire world. Cataclysm is the expansion that tried to fix everything and broke half of it in the process. Launched in December 2010, the premise was ambitious to a fault. Deathwing, the corrupted dragon aspect, literally tore Azeroth apart, and Blizzard used that as justification to completely revamp the original vanilla world from the ground up. New quests, new zone layouts, new storylines. On paper, exactly what the game needed. The old world was showing its age, and new players were getting a noticeably worse experience than veterans had years earlier. But here's where it gets complicated. To modernize the old world, Blizzard had to destroy it first. And I don't mean in a lore sense. They permanently erased the vanilla landscape that millions of players had spent years exploring and forming memories in. The Barrens got split in half. Thousand Needles was flooded. Entire quest chains that defined the leveling experience for half a decade vanished overnight. The new questing was more linear, more accessible, and objectively better designed. But for veterans, logging in felt like walking through your childhood home after someone gutted it and installed an open floor plan. Sure, it's more modern, but it doesn't feel like yours anymore. That's the tragedy of Cataclysm's world revamp. It was simultaneously the right call and a massive loss. Blizzard chose progress, and a significant chunk of the player base never fully forgave them for it. Now, if the world revamp was a philosophical problem, the dungeon situation was a straight-up mechanical disaster. Heroic dungeons at launch were absurdly overtuned. Crowd control was mandatory. One mistake wiped the group. Healers were running out of mana on trash pulls. The difficulty spike from normals to heroics felt less like a step up and more like falling off a cliff. Lead designer Ghostcrawler defended the difficulty as intentional, arguing that Wrath had made heroics too easy, which sounds reasonable until you remember that the vast majority of your player base isn't running optimized compositions with voice comms. They're queuing into the dungeon finder with 4 strangers and hoping for the best, and those players got absolutely steamrolled. Within weeks, Blizzard was already rolling out hotfixes and nerfs which is a pretty clear admission that the original tuning was wrong. You don't start slashing difficulty through emergency hotfixes if everything was working as intended. That's not a philosophy adjustment, that's a fix. The whole expansion carries this energy of being shipped before it was ready. The world revamp consumed so much development time that the actual expansion content felt thin by comparison. Cataclysm is historically defined by that tension between ambition and execution. Blizzard wanted to rebuild the foundation of the entire game while delivering a full expansion on top of it, and the cracks showed everywhere, but at least Cataclysm was trying something bold, even if it stumbled. The next expansion on our list tried something bold too, just about 12 years later, and with a very different set of problems. Dragonflight, after everything Shadowlands put players through, nobody would have blamed the community for being completely checked out. 2 years of borrowed power nightmares, mandatory maw runs, and a story that somehow made the entire afterlife feel boring. So when Blizzard announced Dragonflight in April 2022, the general vibe was less excitement and more prove it. And here's the thing, they actually did. Dragonflight launched in November 2022, and within the first hour of playing, most people realized something had fundamentally changed. Not because of the zones, which were gorgeous, not because of the story, which was fine, but because of dragon riding, a system so good it retroactively made every previous expansion's flying feel like a placeholder. For years, flying in World of Warcraft was basically a toggle. You hit a button, your character floated upward, and you went from point A to point B in a straight line while you alt-tab to check your phone. Blizzard knew this was a problem. That's why they tried removing flying entirely back in Warlords of Draenor, which went about as well as you'd expect. The community rioted, Blizzard caved, and for the next several expansions, nobody had a good answer. Dragon riding was that answer. Instead of a simple on-off switch, dragon riding introduced momentum-based physics where flying was an actual skill. Dive toward the ground to build speed, pull up at the last second to convert that into altitude, chain abilities together to cross entire zones without touching the ground. It felt like a completely different game. Players called it the best new feature World of Warcraft had added in 20 years. And honestly, that's not hyperbole. Dragon riding solved a debate that had plagued the game since 2014 by making flying itself the content rather than just the shortcut that skipped content, but Dragonflight wasn't a one-trick expansion. The whole design philosophy had shifted. Gone were the borrowed power systems that evaporated every patch cycle. The talent trees got a complete overhaul. The profession system was rebuilt from the ground up, turning crafting from a mindless clickfest into something with genuine depth. You weren't just pressing craft at a table anymore. You were sourcing materials, specializing in disciplines, and filling actual orders from other players. The zones were quality across the board. The quests were well written, the pacing was solid, and nothing felt like it existed purely to waste your time. After Shadowlands, that last part mattered more than anything. Dragonflight wasn't trying to trap you, it was trying to earn you back. And for a lot of players, it worked. Not, this is the greatest expansion ever optimism, but the quieter, more meaningful kind. The okay, maybe they actually learned something kind. Dragonflight wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It needed to prove that Blizzard could still make a World of Warcraft expansion that respected your time, and it did exactly that. But if Dragonflight represented WoW finding its footing again, the next expansion we need to talk about is the one that built the foundation in the first place. The Burning Crusade, January 2007. World of Warcraft had already taken over the planet, and then Blizzard decided to release its first ever expansion. The Burning Crusade sold nearly 2.4 million copies in its first 24 hours. Let that sink in. 2.4 million in a single day. By the end of its first month, that number had climbed to roughly 3.5 million, making it the best-selling PC game of 2007 in both North America and Europe, and the third fastest-selling PC game of all time at that point. And here's the thing. Those numbers hit during a time when the game already had 7.5 million subscribers worldwide. This wasn't a struggling franchise getting a boost, this was the biggest game on Earth somehow getting bigger, but the sales aren't even the most important part. What the Burning Crusade actually did for the game was far more significant than any launch day record. It fundamentally proved that the expansion model worked, that you could take a massive online world, bolt an entirely new continent onto it, raise the level cap, add new races, and have millions of people show up on day one ready to do it all all over again. Every single expansion that came after this one exists because TBC proved the concept was viable. The expansion introduced Draenei for the Alliance and Blood Elves for the Horde, which sounds simple on paper until you realize what that actually meant. Alliance players could now roll Shamans, Horde players could now roll Paladins. Class race combinations that had been literally impossible since launch were suddenly on the table, and it completely shifted how both factions approached group composition and endgame strategy. Then there was Karajan, the first 10-player raid in World of Warcraft history. Before TBC, raiding meant organizing 40 people into a functional unit, which is about as easy as herding 40 cats through a thunderstorm, while each cat has a different opinion about loot distribution. Karajan changed everything. Suddenly, smaller guilds could experience raid content. Players who didn't have the time or social infrastructure for 40-man groups could actually see what endgame looked like. It democratized raiding in a way that the game desperately needed, and it's genuinely the reason millions of players ever step foot inside a raid at all. On top of all that, TBC delivered much needed class balance improvements, filled out ability trees that had fell incomplete in vanilla, expanded the endgame dramatically, and introduced new raid difficulty levels that gave players actual progression paths beyond do the same thing but angrier. In the moment, in 2007 and 2008, the Burning Crusade was absolute peak World of Warcraft. There's no debate about that. The game was growing, the community was thriving, and the content felt like it respected your time while still challenging you to get better, so why doesn't it rank higher? Not because it failed, not even close. It ranks where it does because the expansions above it took everything TBC built and pushed it further, like better storytelling, more innovative systems, deeper class design. TBC laid the foundation, it built the house. The expansions that came after just added more rooms. But if you think a beloved expansion can't also be controversial, wait until you hear how the community reacted to Kung Fu Panda's Mists of Pandaria. Here's the thing about Mists of Pandaria. It wasn't a bad expansion. It was an expansion that had the misfortune of showing up right after Cataclysm kicked everyone in the teeth. Players were already frustrated, already skeptical, and then Blizzard walked out on stage and said, hey, here's Kung Fu Pandas. You can imagine how that went. Mists of Pandaria launched in September 2012, and the reaction was immediate and loud. But unlike Warlords of Draenor or Battle for Azeroth, where basically everyone agreed the expansion had serious problems, MOP was genuinely controversial. Reasonable people disagreed. Some players looked at the exotic Asian-inspired continent, the Pandaren race, the lush environments, and thought it was a breath of fresh air. Others looked at the exact same things and thought Blizzard had lost its mind. This wasn't a quality problem, it was a taste problem. And taste problems are way harder to argue about because nobody's technically wrong. But here's where it gets interesting. Underneath the aesthetic debate, Mists of Pandaria introduced one of the most mechanically innovative classes the game has ever seen. The monk ran on an energy and chai resource system with 3 specializations that each did something no other class in the game offered. Brewmaster tanking introduced the stagger mechanic, which took a percentage of physical damage you received and spread it over 10 seconds instead of hitting you all at once. You'd then use Purifying Brew to clear that staggered damage before it ticked through. It was basically damage smoothing as an active gameplay mechanic. No other tank worked like that. You weren't just mitigating hits, you were managing a damage timeline in real time. Windwalker was the DPS spec built around Tiger's Eye Brew, which gave you stacking damage and healing increases the longer you fought. The spec rewarded sustained combat and smart resource management rather than just mashing your biggest ability on cooldown. And then there was Mistweaver, which healed through dealing damage. You'd punch enemies in the face and your Jade Serpent statue would act as a healing turret, converting your offensive output into restoration for your group. Hey, how do you heal? I kick things. What? I kick things, and my magic snake fixes everyone. Each spec felt like it belonged in a completely different game, and somehow they all worked within the same class framework. That's genuinely impressive design. The problem was that none of this mattered to the players who couldn't get past the pandas. And honestly, that's fair. Aesthetic matters in an MMO. You're spending hundreds of hours staring at this world, and if the world doesn't click with you, no amount of clever tank mechanics is going to fix that. But the players who stuck around and engaged with MoP's systems discovered an expansion that was doing things the game had never attempted before. It took years for the community to come around on Mists of Pandaria. Years. The expansion that people mocked at announcement is now regularly cited as one of the better entries in the franchise. Turns out, when you strip away the initial knee-jerk reaction and the residual Cataclysm bitterness, what you're left with is a genuinely well-designed expansion that just happened to have bears on the cover. But if Mists of Pandaria was the expansion that needed time to be appreciated, the next one needed zero time at all, because Legion showed up and immediately reminded everyone what World of Warcraft was capable of. Legion is the expansion that made people fall back in love with World of Warcraft. And I don't mean in a, yeah, it was pretty good kind of way. I mean, in a grown adults were logging in every single day for 2 years straight and never once feeling like the game was wasting their time kind of way. It launched in August 2016, and it is consistently ranked right alongside Wrath of the Lich King as the greatest expansion ever produced, which, considering what came before it, is nothing short of miraculous. Here's the thing about Legion. It didn't just do one thing well, it did everything well. Simultaneously, every major system felt like a direct answer to a problem that had been plaguing the game for years, and somehow Blizzard nailed every single one at the same time. Let's start with the world quests. Before Legion, max level content meant daily quests, the same quests every day. World quests replaced that entire system with dynamic, varied objectives that rotated across the map on timers, different rewards, different activities, different reasons to actually go out into the world. You weren't running a checklist anymore, you were making choices. Then there were class order halls, which were basically Blizzard looking at the garrison disaster from Warlords and saying, okay, what if we did the exact opposite of that? Instead of isolating every player inside their own private base, order halls brought players together in class-specific hubs. You were surrounded by other players who shared your class identity, and it made the game feel like an MMO again, which is, you know, kind of the whole point. But the crown jewel was artifact weapons. Every spec received a legendary weapon with its own lore, its own visual identity, and its own progression tree. Retribution Paladins got Ashbringer. Frost Death Knights got the shards of Frostmourne reforged into twin blades. These weren't just stat sticks. They were characters unto themselves, with quest lines to obtain them and visual customizations to unlock. The system technically qualified as borrowed power, a concept that would become a dirty word in later expansions, but Legion made it feel personal rather than restrictive. Nobody complained about artifact weapons, nobody, and we haven't even gotten to the Demon Hunter class, which gave players a brand new double jumping, gliding, I-beam firing experience unlike anything else in the game, or the flexible zone scaling that let you quest through the Broken Isles in any order, or Suramar, an entire endgame zone built around a reputation-gated quest chain that told one of the most compelling stories the game had ever produced. Players weren't just grinding reputation, they were uncovering a civilization struggle against demonic occupation, and every new chapter felt earned, and after all that, Blizzard dropped Argus, an entirely new zone added post-launch that took players to the homeworld of the Burning Legion itself. Most expansions struggled to deliver one memorable content patch. Legion delivered. The phrase that gets used about Legion more than any other is, "We may never see its like again." And that's not nostalgia talking. The systems reinforced each other. The content was abundant. The classes felt distinct and powerful. It wasn't one great idea carried by mediocre execution. It was a dozen great ideas, all executed at the highest level, all at the same time. But even Legion's legacy couldn't protect the franchise from what came next. Because if Legion proved that Blizzard could learn from every mistake, the expansion that followed it would prove they could forget those lessons just as fast. The War Within. For years, World of Warcraft had a dirty little secret that everybody knew about, but nobody at Blizzard seemed interested in fixing. If you wanted to play more than one character, the game actively punished you for it. Every new alt meant regrinding reputations you'd already earned, rediscovering flight paths you'd already unlocked, and releveling systems you'd already mastered. It was like the game had amnesia every time you logged into a different character. Then, The War Within launched in August 2020 2024 and quietly changed everything. The headline feature was the warband system, and on paper it sounds boring. Account-wide progression, no new class, no world-shattering cataclysm, just the radical idea that your account should remember what you've already done. But here's the thing, this one system did more for the average player's quality of life than entire expansions worth of flashy features. Warbands share faction reputation across all your characters. Flight paths you discover on your main automatically unlock for every alt. Resources pool across the account instead of sitting trapped on characters you haven't logged into since 2019. Companion levels for the new Delve endgame activity carry over, so you're not starting from scratch every single time. It's the kind of stuff that makes you wonder why it took 20 years to implement. The leveling experience for alts got a complete overhaul too. Players were getting roughly 2 levels per dungeon, which is dramatically faster than anything WoW had offered before. On top of that, every character you hit max level on gives you a stacking 5% experience buff for future alts, up to 25% bonus. The game was finally rewarding you for playing more instead of punishing you for it. And look, Blizzard deserves credit here, but let's be honest about the context. Other MMOs had been doing versions of this for years. Account-wide progression, shared unlocks, alt-friendly systems. These weren't revolutionary ideas in the broader MMO space. They were revolutionary for WoW specifically, because WoW had been stubbornly clinging to character-isolated progression since 2004. The War Within wasn't inventing the wheel, it was finally admitting that wheels exist. Beyond warbands, the expansion added new hero talents that gave existing classes fresh customization layers, introduced the Earthen as a new allied race, and launched Delves as scalable endgame content for solo and small group players outside the traditional raid pipeline. None of these individually would have defined an expansion, but stacked together with warbands, they created something genuinely impressive. The result is what many players describe as the best state WoW has ever been in for playing multiple characters. You don't need to treat every alt like a second job anymore. You log in, you play, and the game respects the time you've already invested, which is, you know, not ideal that it took this long, but better late than never. The War Within doesn't have the dramatic narrative hook of a Lich King or the spectacle of a world revamp. What it has is something harder to market, but arguably more important, a fundamental shift in how the game treats its players. It stopped fighting them, and that quiet revolution is exactly why it ranks this high. But if you think modernizing alt progression is impressive, wait until you hear about the expansion that defined what World of Warcraft was supposed to be in the first place, Wrath of the Lich King. Every expansion on this list got something wrong. Every single one, whether it was borrowed power, empty content patches, controversial systems, or narratives that fell apart under scrutiny, they all had a fatal flaw somewhere. Wrath of the Lich King didn't, and that's not nostalgia talking, that's just what happened. Launching in November 2008 as WoW's second expansion, Wrath introduced the Death Knight class, and the way it did, it remains one of the greatest onboarding sequences in gaming history. You didn't start as a hero, you started as a villain. Players literally began their Death Knight journey under the direct control of the Lich King, carrying out his orders, slaughtering innocents, doing genuinely terrible things in his name. And then you broke free. You earned your redemption through gameplay, not a cutscene. The rune-based resource system was completely unlike anything else in the game at the time. Dual-wielding unholy power with a mechanical identity that made every other class feel like they'd been built from the same template. Death Knights felt alien, they felt dangerous, they felt like exactly what a former servant of darkness should feel like, but the class was only part of it. Northrend provided a storyline that no WoW expansion has matched since, and the reason is simple: Arthas. The Lich King wasn't some interdimensional threat players had never heard of. He was a tragic prince whose fall from grace players had watched firsthand in Warcraft 3. You saw him pick up Frostmourne, you saw him murder his own father, you saw the moment a good man became a monster. So when you finally set foot in Northrend and his presence loomed over every zone, every dungeon, every raid, the stakes weren't manufactured, they were earned. Years of emotional investment paid off in a single expansion, and Blizzard knew exactly how to use it. Here's the thing that makes Wrath genuinely untouchable though. It wasn't beloved by one type of player, it was beloved by all of them. Casual players had accessible dungeons and a compelling world to explore. Hardcore raiders had Ulduar and Ice Crown Citadel, two of the greatest raids ever designed. PvP players had Winter Grasp in a balanced arena meta. Story-focused players had Arthas. Achievement hunters had an entire system that was still fresh and exciting. Nobody was left out. Nobody felt like the expansion wasn't built for them, and the numbers reflected it. Wrath of the Lich King coincided with WoW's absolute peak subscriber count, over 12 million players all logging in, all engaged, all finding something worth their time. The game has never hit that number again, not even close. That's what separates Wrath from everything else on this list. Legion came close with its systems design. Burning Crusade laid the foundation. Mists of Pandaria surprised people, but none of them achieved what Wrath achieved, which was making every single element fire at the same time. Narrative, mechanics, community, and content all operating at their absolute ceiling simultaneously. No weak link, no asterisk, no it was great except for this one thing. It was just great. The whole thing, start to finish. And 20 years into this game's life, nothing has topped it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.